Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Chad Toprak. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the director of Freeplay. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Freeplay hosts and broadcasts from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, where stories have been shared and games have been played since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to anyone watching who has a connection to the world's oldest continuing culture. Sovereignty was never ceded, and the violence of the colonial project is ongoing. Freeplay also stands in solidarity with Black communities, both here and around the world, against prejudice, injustice, and violence. Black Lives Matter is not a new or revolutionary statement, but it is one that needs to be said and said again and said louder. So welcome to this session called Rituals of Play in a Global Pandemic. We'd like to thank our partner, City of Melbourne and Knowledge Melbourne for helping make this session possible. Hosting this session is Douglas Wilson. Doug is a co-owner of Die Gute Fabrik, a game studio based in Copenhagen, Denmark. He has worked on a number of award-winning video games, including Johann Sebastian Joust, Sports Friends, and Mutazione. Doug now lives in Melbourne, Australia, where he is a lecturer at RMIT University, teaching and researching game design. Please make Doug and our panel welcome, and I'll hand it over to Doug.
Hey, thanks, Chad, and thanks everyone live in the YouTube joining us. Thank you, Freeplay, for having us. Thanks to Melbourne Knowledge Week for partnering with this session. So first, before we begin, a little context for this panel. When putting together this session, Chad and I wanted to address a timely topic that would speak to a wide cross-section of audiences. Given that Freeplay and Knowledge Week themselves had to move online in response to the ongoing pandemic, we thought it would be appropriate to examine how games, art, and tech more broadly are all adapting to lockdown conditions. So the question we're asking in this session is, as our daily lives get disrupted by COVID-19, how does that affect how we all play together? Now, at first glance, that question may seem a little trivial in a time of great tragedy and upheaval. In the face of mass death, racial inequality, and the increasingly clear stakes of police violence, does playing even matter? And I would argue, yes, it does. Even in a time of crisis, we can't shake our innate desire to play. Play matters. It brings people together, and like all forms of culture, it gives us a space to reflect on larger cultural and political issues. So to address these questions and issues, we've assembled an expert panel of 6 game makers, curators, and educators to reflect on how their own play practices have adapted to pandemic conditions and what those new rituals might tell us about life in the year 2020. Now, it's a bummer we can't do this session in person, but the silver lining of doing this online is that we can include some speakers from overseas, which is great, and mixed in with a couple of Melbourne locals. So we tried to deliberately get that blend of experts for you. Now, I'll introduce each speaker in turn, each of whom will give us a 10-minute micro talk. And we'll have times for questions, a question or two after each micro talk. So if you're in the YouTube live chat, feel free to start thinking about it and sending in your questions during the micro talks. If we have extra time after all 5 micro talks, we'll open up for some additional questions and discussions. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? I hope so. We've got our micro talkers waiting in the wings here on the video call, and I super appreciate them taking all the time to join us to talk to all of you. So first, here we're going to go one by one. Each of them will give their micro talk. We have, to kick us off, Marie Foulston, who is a curator and creative producer of playful exhibitions, installations, and experiences. She is co-founder of UK-based experimental video game collective Wild Rumpus. And most recently, she was curator of video games at the V&A and was guest director of Now Play This in 2020. Yes. She has worked alongside a host of international organizations, including Penguin Random House, the Smithsonian, the Game Developers Conference, London Film Festival, Channel 4, the AGO, and Mopop. All of which is to say, we're really lucky to have Marie here with us today. Hi, Marie.
There we go. I'm muting myself. Good morning.
Good
Or
morning.
good evening.
Good
or whatever
evening.
time of day. Or good night as well. Thank you for having me.
Yes. Marie, do you want to share your screen and we can get into it?
I do. Okay, let's make sure I share the right screen. We're coming down here and we're going to click Google Chrome. It says good night. It is not good night, for me at least. Can you see that okay, Doug?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So should I take it from here?
Please, yeah. I'll mute my mic and take it away.
Well, yeah, hi everybody. So there's two things that I wanted to say before I get started. First of all, Black trans lives matter. Secondly, as a curator, I also wanted to just comment on my thoughts on interpretation. And that I'm a curator who's interested in, I guess, radical interpretation. I've never been a fan of small text plaques or text descriptions in informing or educating people about the nature of an object or a heritage, an object of heritage. So I'm quite interested in how these radical acts of interpretation have greatly educated people about racist statues and landmarks and heritage icons at the moment. So in my opinion, rolling them into the sea and decapitating them has been quite a radical and effective means of interpreting and educating people about those people and about what they did. Yeah, so moving on to what I wanted to talk about today, which is specifically a party in a shared Google Doc that I hosted way back at the beginning of May. So I am actually in that spreadsheet now, and it's something that is still online. So if you want to come join me in that spreadsheet, if you put this URL into your browser, it will take you, maybe not in the tab which the talk is in, but in another tab. It will take you into the spreadsheet, and so you can be in that spreadsheet with me, which is short url.at/FPRX, and then capital H. Yeah, so in here at the moment we have, oh look, we have a gaggle of sun animals. So we have a sheep, we have an anonymous kiwi, and we have an anonymous alligator. So good morning and thanks for coming. If you wander off on the spreadsheet and you need to find me again, if you see my icon at the top, which should be my face or the Tiger's Hungry logo, just click on that and it will bring you to where I am on the spreadsheet. So yeah, so party in a shared Google Doc. This was a project that I undertook at the beginning of May. And I am a curator whose work is normally about bringing playful work and playful experiences into shared public spaces. And as we know at the moment, that is something that is not possible. So that lack of context, I think, or the usual context that my work takes place in, has pushed me into a space which has felt quite existential and quite experimental at the moment. And so it's a period when I've been interested in finding what other ways are there that we could be together and be together playfully, and what ways as a curator can I work to bring to people together. This spreadsheet was not a professional thing that I was doing. This was a, I think more of a sort of 3 a.m. decision about doing something. And also to caveat this with the fact that I'm not the first person, actually. I have since learned to have hosted a party in a shared Google Doc, nor to have done creative work within that as a medium. But there's a whole host of really interesting things that people have done within Google Sheets and Google Spreadsheets. But yeah, so this was a party that I hosted back on the 2nd of May. This was my party invite, as you can see, that I made on Instagram stories, complete with this nice little rotating GIF of a disco ball. So the party was, so where we are now is the front page of the party, which was the door for people coming in. So this party was one which I didn't open up to the public. This was one which was just open to friends and sort of mutual friends. Partly because I was very conscious about how on earth you sort of police sort of moderate that within a space. So it was something that friends and mutual friends and acquaintances were invited to come into. I met when I was setting this up, I wasn't entirely sure what the protocol or what the sort of etiquette is about how much you should decorate a spreadsheet for a house party. So before I set it up, I had this front page which had the front door. It had some of the information about sort of guiding people about what they could or couldn't, or what they could do within this space, which really was sort of saying like, hey, come in, start a tab, edit anything that you want to, and we'll sort of see where that goes. Yeah, so the first places that I created was this. I'd also created a little dance floor, which you can see on this tab, which was my black spreadsheet with some little colored cells for my dance floor. So oh yeah, and I had a coat room as well, which was, as you do at a party, just a tab which allowed people to come and cut and paste their coats in when they arrived at the party. So when this party first started, those were the only two spaces that were really sort of open and available to people. And whilst it was starting, I tabbed away to go sort of invite people and share the link in other spaces. And by the time I came back, there had already been a hallway and a kitchen added to the party. And the hallway was sort of the first space that was really populated, which is where we are now. And so on this spreadsheet or on this cell, this page, what started happening was this sort of became the place where everybody was introducing themselves. So this was a real hive of activity right at the beginning. And the thing, obviously, that people came to the party as was anonymous animals, because when I was sharing it, there was not necessarily an effective way of doing so, which would allow people to have the link and to give them edit permission. So instead, people came in as anonymous animals. And this was a space where people were sort of announcing who was there, and also where people were just trying to find out, like, hey, which animal have I actually come as? And so this whole sheet just started to fill up and spread down with this sort of emergent sort of game of people trying to identify which animal they've come as. So you can see sort of these echoes of sort of Nico coming in and wanting to find out what animal he was, and finding out later that he was a moose, or people learning that they're chameleons. And so you had this space of this sort of emergent play of sort of where people were trying to figure out sort of their identities within this space. So after the hallway, one of the other spaces that started up, as you'd expect in a party, everybody started congregating in the kitchen. And the kitchen, we had some floor tiles that started to appear. People cut and pasted in a bucket of beer, which you can see here. Someone also bought some Percy Pigs. I think that person knows that I'm a big fan of Percy Pigs in the extended Percy Pig universe. We have a little cocktail cheese and pineapple cocktail hedgehog down here. In this space, somebody put in a bowl of mysterious punch. And to go with that, I just added in some ASCII cups so that people had some clean cups to drink from. And one of the things that I felt when I was in different spaces and moving from sheet to sheet as the course of the night went on was this feeling of, is there something else happening on another sheet? Is everybody congregated in a different place? Is everybody talking somewhere else? And realizing that as a host, I had the same anxieties within virtual spaces as I do within sort of physical spaces. And that same sense of FOMO when you're at a normal party, like, wait, am I in the room where all the action is happening? Another thing that's really was really interesting sort of as the night went on is just thinking about the way in which communication operated within the spreadsheet, which was that because everybody was coming as anonymous animals, that there was not the ability to use the shared chat function, which you sometimes can within Google Docs or Google Sheets. And that meant that instead, the only way for people to communicate was in the individual cells and in the sheet itself, which was sort of editing that space. And that means that nobody really sort of, apart from in the moment or the time in which somebody is typing a message or placing it into a cell, that nobody really has an idea of who is speaking to who or who is saying what, where and when. And so you have this really strange sense of sort of a conversation sort of just loitering or hanging in the air after you've had it or whilst you're taking part in it. And also it was a really strange experience in knowing that when you're typing in a cell and sometimes you come across another person in this spreadsheet and you're talking to them, that actually neither of you necessarily know, like, is this somebody who is a really good friend, or is this somebody that is a complete stranger to me? And it's something that for me really challenged my sense of, how do I hold conversations? How do I hold myself? What do I say to somebody when actually I don't have the social construct of or awareness of who this person is? And that's it was a really strange sort of experience and a strange feeling as we were sort of traveling around the spreadsheet. And so over the course of the night, different sheets sort of started popping up. So the dance floor didn't look like this at the beginning, but started to evolve. And we had people adding in sort of their DJ song requests down here. Somebody did set up a karaoke song at the top, and that karaoke song, I think originally was Bonnie Tyler's Total Eclipse, but following the recommendation somewhere through the night, I changed that to Genuine's Pony, which I think is the song that will start blasting when you click on the on that link. And so the party sort of began to expand in different places and in different ways. And people sort of started to experiment and get quite a little bit more sort of, I guess, sort of experimental, a little bit more elaborate in their communication. So this, where we are at the moment, is the blue room. I arrived on this sheet during the night at the point when it was just a completely blank spreadsheet. And then somebody just decided to fill all of the cells blue. And so that's why it became the blue room, complete with, as we can see here, the Blue Man Group. We have the pop band Blue. And then some people over the night as well began to chip away at the paint in the room and discovered sort of the previous paint colors and the different colors of that room was previously. And so sort of early on in this sort of party, you have this sort of real hub of activity, really people communicating, people moving around quickly, people moving from sheet to sheet and doing different things. And the tone of the evening sort of changed sort of quite a lot as time went on. So after about an hour or so into the party, what happened was that mode of sort of communication and that, I guess, sort of interactivity sort of changed to a different mode where people were undertaking slightly different, sort of more elaborate creative experiences. So one of my favorite things that happened was that somebody created this page, which was a paint by numbers that uses conditional formatting. And so sort of quite late on in the party, the thing that happened was that most guests sort of moved over to this paint by numbers tab. And instead of sort of talking directly to each other or typing directly to each other, people were just sort of moving around, typing numbers in and using that to sort of create different patterns and colors. It felt a little bit like being in an arts and crafts corner with people doing sort of finger painting. But there's a whole range of different things. And so if you want to explore this and look at some of the other different forms of creativity that sort of took place here, then there's lots of different things. And it's really lovely to spend, or it was really lovely for me to spend time afterwards, after the party, sort of traveling through this spreadsheet, going tens of thousands of cells down and finding conversations that I was not in or had no part of during the night. And just finding out that all these really interesting and different things had been happening. But yeah, and so I'll take us to end this talk. I'll take us to the place where I actually ended the evening myself, which was on the sunrise tab, which was something that was created by, I've later found out, my friend B. Buckingham. And as we scroll down, we can see sort of why this is the sunrise tab as the numbers go from, I think, sort of 0 to whichever number it goes to. The colors sort of slowly change from sort of this dark blue to that sort of watching the sun come up. And I think for me, sort of the experiences that I had doing this is that I'm really, whilst we have sort of these tools such as Zoom or video games or other spaces to interact and be together, I think sometimes a lot of those are pushing towards often quite this literal representation of what it means to be together and what it means to communicate to each other. And being in spaces that are sort of absurd and not necessarily designed for, I guess, social experiences. So using a spreadsheet to have a party in is, I guess, sort of an absurd thing to do, but something that is also quite insightful and can show us different things about different experiences that both echo our real world experiences and anxieties of being at a party, but also, I guess, can bump up against new feelings and new experiences of what it means to also try and socialize and congregate in a spreadsheet. And I hope from this, like, I'm really interested in people exploring these more abstract and more speculative ways of being together and socializing together. And I think for me, as a playful curator and with games designers, this is something that we're all really sort of, I guess, sort of well suited to undertake at the moment. And I hope is obviously something that will run through, or I know will run through the other threads of presentations from other speakers this morning, is that I think we're all people who are really well suited to exploring these quite practical and quite absurd spaces, which I think can show us some really insightful ways and interesting things about what it means to be together, either in person or in real life. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Marie. Marie, maybe if you unscreen share, because we'll do the dance of each speaker.
Just trying to figure out how to get
there.
There we go.
Yeah, excellent.
And I'm going to mute myself.
Hold on. Let's see if we have any questions for Marie while with her microtalk still fresh in mind from the chat. There's some discussion going on in the YouTube live chat. Any questions for Marie or from even our fellow panelists? If not, I will ask a question because I always have questions. just give everyone a sec too. And by the way, during these micro talks, definitely feel free to continue asking questions and tee up questions in the chats. So Marie, we have Ted asking, are you ever running another party?
Oh, good question. I don't know. I don't personally think I will be. That I don't know if I've just immortalized this one enough for me that I'm just sort of like scared of doing another one. Or sort of, yeah. So I think it's been really lovely actually seeing different spaces and different people sort of be inspired by this and host their own parties. So I know Bang Bang Con ran a spreadsheet party and also have done something really, they've sort of evolved the idea into sort of coding parties as well. I've seen sort of people doing sort of escape rooms in Google Docs as well. So I think for me personally, perhaps not a party. And also, do you know what? I'm a really anxious host and I get anxious sort of hosting things. I like attending things, not necessarily hosting them. But yeah, so maybe not, but it's been really great to see other people do that and take that on.
Marie, one more comment from a discussion that was in the chat and then we'll move on. We had Shalev ask, or kind of wonder out loud, I wonder if there were people in the party from different cultures and if they projected different imaginations on what kind of house and or party this is. So presumably you had a mix of people from some different countries, but still a subset. Can you speak to that, or whether there were cultural differences?
Well, I'm conscious that because it was, I can't speak to necessarily who was there because it was all anonymous animals. I know retrospectively that there's some friends that I've spoken to who were present. And also I'm aware that it's sort of within my friendship group, which means that it is going to sort of skew perhaps towards sort of a British, and equally because of the timing as well, to sort of British attendees. And people have asked me before, like about how it sets the tone, how did you set the tone? And I think it was something, or the scene, that this is a space that I think became really sort of like it was a space for role play as well, sort of role playing. It was like being at a party, but also role playing being what it was like at a party. And for me, it was thinking about, okay, how much of the stage do you set for that? And for me, I think even in just naming it a party was sort of something which steered that role play in a certain direction and set the tone in a certain direction. But also I spent many hours deliberating about what front door to put on the front sheet, which if you remember and saw, like it was this sort of gray front door, which for me looks like it belongs like in a British cul-de-sac. There was a couple of balloons pinned up. So for me, that I think that sort of set a tone about sort of the nature of the location. And another one of the doors that I had previously was this beautiful, pristine pink door with this beautiful balloon arch, but it looked a bit something like a Desperate Housewives. So I'm conscious that sort of my sort of own social group and sort of friends who came to that will have influenced that. And also the fact that I think the small things that I put into that place did set the tone of what that party was. Even just something small like setting up the coat room as well, that it's like, okay, this is something which sort of, which cues people up to think about the space in a certain way.
Yeah, thank you. More questions, but we should move on so we get to all the micro talks. Thank you, Marie. Next up, Rami Ismail. Hi, Rami. We can slowly start sharing your screen and audio. So a quick introduction. Rami Ismail is the business and development guy at LeMieux, a Dutch independent game studio known best for Nuclear Throne, Ridiculous Fishing, Luftrausers, Super Crate Box, Gun Gods, and Serious Sam, The Random Encounter. Hello, Rami. Nice to see you.
Hi. Good to see you as well.
Rami, why don't you start sharing your screen, and that should take over the view.
Let's see. That does. That's going to be interesting because it's all working.
If that doesn't work, we can also re.
I'll figure it out. I'll just do with just slides. That'll work. It's going to show a little bit from the game I'm talking about, but does that show up?
Yeah.
Perfect. Good. Let me find the slides. Hi. I am Rami Ismail. As Doug said, I am a game developer at LeMieux. I am also a Muslim, and that is what I want to talk about. But to give a little bit of context for what this talk is actually about, it's about the intersection between Islam and Animal Crossing. And I love Animal Crossing. I've actually not been a huge Animal Crossing fan so far, but New Horizons was the first one I really jumped in on. I played one of the previous ones a bit and I enjoyed it, but this one came out with, in the most grim way of saying it, with perfect timing, considering the COVID crisis. One of the things that made this game very good for the current crisis, really, is that Animal Crossing does something special with its time. In Animal Crossing, the time progresses in the game at the same speed as it does in real life, and the day in the game also matches the day in real life. And there's a bunch of time travel and, I don't know, advanced strategies you can use for that. But for my purposes, it was great that there was something that sort of pushed me to wake up, to look at the stores, which are only open between, certain hours in the morning, certain hours in the evening. So it gives a bit of a schedule. It's basically Nintendo telling me to not just sleep through the day and work during the night because I won't be able to go to the stores. So this calendar functionality of Animal Crossing, this name time functionality of Animal Crossing, made it very, very appropriate for this time now, where my days were sort of slowly losing shape. My friends were all around the world, and there was nothing really keeping me in a schedule. Now, one of the other interesting things that allows us to do is Animal Crossing has religious holidays. This was Bunny Day, and it's a soft metaphor for Easter. And during Bunny Day, players were to collect eggs and then use those eggs to build specific items, to craft specific items, and then get rewards for that. And obviously, Animal Crossing is not a game that's going to flat out put a religious holiday in there, but they use these sort of analogies or these sort of aspects from these holidays in ways that are recognizable and are fun and make people feel at home. I loved Bunny Day. It was great. I had a great time. But at that point, slowly, in real life, something started coming up. There is the Muslim month of Ramadan. And Ramadan is this very important moment in the Muslim year. It is our 9th month. The Muslim calendar is a lunar calendar, so every month starts with the new moon and ends with the new moon. And during the month of Ramadan, Muslims can't eat or drink or consume anything in any way from sunrise to sunset. Sunrise is there's a meal called suhoor, and at sunset there's a meal called iftar. And these are these big communal celebratory meals all around the Muslim world. People eat out on the streets with friends, with family. People eat in big groups. People eat at mosques. This is in Cairo. I'm half Egyptian, so Cairo obviously is very dear to my heart. I spent a few years growing up there. Ramadan is a time of togetherness. It's not just a time of fasting. In many ways, when I was a kid, I was always very upset that my holidays would involve not eating, and all my Dutch friends' holidays would involve Christmas dinners and like big meals and celebrations and all sorts of things like that, until my dad pointed out that we effectively get 30 days of Christmas dinner. Every night we get together with our family, with our friends, and we eat these big meals that honestly just taste better because you haven't eaten all day. COVID kind of threw a wrench in that. This is, for me, one of the most staggering photos I have seen in my entire life. This is the Kaaba in Mecca, which is the holiest place in Islam. And if Muslims were the primary filmmakers of today, every zombie movie would start with this shot, because Mecca is not supposed to be empty. This is an apocalyptic view. Like, the idea of this space having no people in there is so staggering that when I saw this photo, it was the first time that I recognized that the floor is white, because normally it's just full of people. I had no idea. And I've seen this place every day of my life. As a kid, my dad would have this on TV for prayer every day, and I just didn't know. So instead of these big communal meals and these together meals, Ramadan this year was going to be very lonely. I live alone, and I was going to eat alone. That is really that's not what Ramadan is to me normally. So I was really I was not looking forward to having to do Ramadan alone. So a tiny part of me thought, well, if Animal Crossing can do Easter, then surely they can find a similar analogy for Ramadan, right? Ramadan is attached to the moon. So maybe do something like a moon month. And maybe the villagers will come together and have a little meal or gift each other stuff, just like in Ramadan. It doesn't have to be called Ramadan. It can be called moon month. It doesn't have to be explicit. It can be implicit. And then Ramadan started, and obviously there was absolutely nothing. So I decided, well, if they won't do it, I will do it. So I made a tiny little Ramadan suhoor iftar spot in Animal Crossing, just like the ones I saw in Egypt. And I put a tweet out that people could just DM me and come sit around a bit. And I honestly didn't expect much to happen. Instead of that, what happened is so many people reached out that I had to create a method to make sure that not too many people would show up, because Animal Crossing won't allow more than 8 people on your island at the same time. But I allowed people to visit me, and we would sit together at this table. And throughout the month of Ramadan, I did this every Monday, every Wednesday, and every Friday. And it was incredible. People would bring gifts. They would bring meals. They would eat at the last time when the sun would rise. We would talk about faith. We would talk about friends. We would talk about life. Half of the people that were there were Muslim. Half of the people that were there were not. People were from all over the world. I've had people from Indonesia, Singapore, from South America, from Latin, from Europe, from Africa, from the Middle East. And I honestly was a little worried that there would be trolling or there would be attempts to sort of disorganize things, because there is a pretty strong anti-Muslim sentiment around the world. But instead, we sat and we talked about how the moon was, right? The full moon in this picture indicates that we're halfway through Ramadan, because the new moon indicates that it ends. And we talked about that. And we just sat there with the voice chat open, with these strangers, with these friends. And it was just the sweetest, kindest thing. It was so real and so genuine, because it is a real place with a real time. This is a place that I built. I could show people around. I could show them my house. I could show them my island. And every night had a different flavor to it. Every time I did this, some groups were very playful. Some groups were very serious. Some groups were overwhelmingly Arab, so we spoke in Arabic. But every time it felt different. It was different, because the same place with different people is a different place. And I don't remember why we were yelling at the sea in this one, but it was a very good one. So as this idea spread, I realized that I was not the only one doing it anymore. People started DMing me with all these images of other people organizing the same thing. This group isn't mine. This isn't my island. This is a different group of people. And they brought together their Muslim friends from around the world. And this specific person actually built a mosque in their Animal Crossing as well. And they would do these prayers that are traditional during Ramadan, where every day of the month you read a 30th of the Quran, so that by the end of Ramadan you've read the full Quran. And they would do those together. I didn't end up building a mosque because we have to pray towards Mecca, and I don't know where my island is in relation to Mecca, so I couldn't figure out which direction the mosque had to be pointed in. So I did not end up building a mosque. They just said East is good and just, kept it at that. But I will say it was really lovely to build this, and it was really jarring to have to build this. And even more jarring to me was the notion that games are clearly great for this. And despite that, not anybody in the traditional gaming scene that I know of took any interest in this. All the interest that I found was outside of games. This is eater.com, which is a website about food, which was the first media outlet to write about this. After that, the Washington Post wrote about it, Vice wrote about it, and BuzzFeed wrote about it. Not a single game site wrote about it, and I actually ended up looking that up. It turns out most of them have never written about Ramadan at all, despite this being the most important month of the year for 2 billion people around the world. And gaming culture does not acknowledge Ramadan. There is no touchstone with Muslim culture in games. And even though there are a few efforts right now, they're very few and far between. Because one of the things that I think, and I don't know because I'm only half Western. To me, Easter has never felt as a thing I celebrate. And I think it feels homely to just have that happen in your game. And I think that seeing Christmas, if you celebrate Christmas, makes you feel warm inside in Animal Crossing. But I wouldn't know because those are not my holidays. And the holidays I celebrate, they're not there. So I have to make them myself. And play, presence, recognition, they are big words. They're important words to games, to what we do, to what we make, and to how people experience our worlds. And if we want to make sure that everybody can feel at home here, then it would be nice to not have to build this myself in the future. Thank you.
Hey, applause. Thank you, Rami.
Most welcome.
Do we have any questions? Again, I'll ask one if needed, but from the live YouTube chat or from our fellow panelists. Any questions? Any questions from our fellow panelists? Don't have to. Nope. We do have a bunch of applause and thanks for Rami in the chat. Remember, for the next talks, please feel free to let us know if you have any questions. We're deliberately keeping these talks a little short so that we can get through most people. So provocative little glimpses of play during a pandemic. Rami, we do have one question for you emerging.
Sure thing.
We have Miriam in the chat. What was your favorite meal this Ramadan?
Oh boy. I ended up, one of the nights, I ended up making a meal called macaroni bechamel, and it is my Egyptian grandmother's specialty. But it was one of those meals that takes like 4 hours to prepare. And growing up, I always saw her make it. But she passed away about a decade ago and never really gave us the recipe, and I've never dared to make it. And this year, I think being in isolation and being alone and feeling so distant from my culture and from my heritage and from my family, I decided to try it anyway. I was always scared that it wouldn't be good. You know, that the last time I ate macaroni bechamel was my grandma's, and it was so good, and I would hate to have the last one be a very bad one that I made myself. But I think the isolation and encouragement from people at the Animal Crossing event actually pushed me to try it, and it came out pretty good. It's not my grandma's, but she had a secret recipe of making it for her grandchild, I guess, and I don't have that secret ingredient here, so it'll take some practice to make it better. But it was really lovely to make something that was hers and make it my own for the future. And I guess in that way, she lives on a little too, right? So it was a very good meal.
We have another question, and thanks, Ted, for passing this on from The Zone, which I'm hoping everyone is checking out, the Freeplay Zone. Maybe we can link that in the chat. But the question was, Rami, how would you like to see Ramadan covered in the future in outlets?
I mean, the main thing is this is the central event. Like, imagine that there was a month where for the entire month, the Western world would wake up at 3 a.m. and then have dinner at the same time at 9 p.m., right? Imagine what that would do to our culture and to our life. Like, shops would open later, just like they do in the Arab world. There would be specific events, there would be get-togethers, there would be all sorts of stuff. Honestly, the way I would like Ramadan to be covered, I'm not at the point where I can choose how I want it to be covered. I just want it to be covered. We're not even at that step yet. I haven't seen any coverage of Ramadan that I can be a little disappointed by, because we just haven't started. Like, the big challenge is that everybody is so scared of getting it wrong, right? Because everybody has this strange idea that if you get Muslim things wrong, that, you know, they'll come storming down the doors and kick down your like desks or something. Because everybody that I've talked to about this weird void of Ramadan content has just said editorial found it too risky, or I pushed for it, or, you know, the game doesn't want to be controversial, or it's fear. It's fear of the unknown. It's fear of Muslims. And honestly, any coverage would be great. Like, I mean, it's hard to be negative about Ramadan, I guess. Like, it's a celebratory month for a month. If you're sick or pregnant or otherwise you can't fast, you don't have to. It's like my dad tried to convince me when I was a kid. It's 30 days of Christmas dinner. Like, there's infinite great stuff you can write about it, you can do about it. There's infinite great content you can put in your games. There's infinite, like, wings you can make without being explicit that it is Ramadan if you want to avoid that. Somehow just nobody has tried. And that is kind of staggering to me, because it is a quarter of the world's population. Just here in the West, like in the Western world, as far as culture go, like, Muslims might as well not exist. Like, we're invisible.
Rami, one more question before we move on.
Sure.
From our fellow panelist, Stephanie, who will be presenting later in the session. Stephanie asked, Animal Crossing is kind of like a dollhouse where you're relatively limited in how you can interact with it. Did you find that the constraints of the game worked to your advantage compared to other possible platforms?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I think the magic of Animal Crossing in this regard was that it allowed me just enough ability to express a certain idea. And the way that I turned that space from a table with seats into a Ramadan space was that I could give the little placemats a custom image. And I drew a little moon on it, a green background, golden moon, just like Ramadan art normally is. Ramadan placements, Ramadan media is this beautiful green tone with a golden moon. And I just drew that. And it was instantly a Ramadan place. But if I had the ability to draw everything, it would have felt too much. It would have felt overwhelming to try and make it perfect. I would have had the space to get every nitpick right. And here we're just like, okay, here's one detail. That detail makes it Ramadan, and that's good. And I think that constraints always drive creativity in interesting ways. I think Animal Crossing has found a remarkable balance between freedom and constraint that allows a lot of expression.
Well, great. Thank you again, Rami.
Thank you for having me.
Keep on trucking along. Our next speaker, Shang Woon, hello. Feel free to unmute yourself and appear. There you are.
Hello.
I'm going to introduce you, but feel free to start sharing your screen as needed. Harry Lee Shang Woon is joining us. Is an anti-disciplinary artist with a background in medicine and commerce. He is the director of Play Reactive, a Melbourne-based studio making bold interactive experiences from museum exhibitions to immersive theater. His artistic practice centers games and play as a way to explore complex systems, transform public space, and strengthen communities. Very happy to have you with us. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Doug. So yeah, I'm Shang, and I sometimes make video games. There's a huge debate that sometimes comes about whether video games should be one word or two words. I'm very specifically spelling it as not just two words, but with two spaces. And I know Marie Foulston in her work at the V&A had this interesting problem of whether to present it as two words or one word, and very sneakily put like a literal screen between them. Well, here I'm talking about video games that put a literal screen between us, the players. After all, at the end of the day, a game is just a material for play, drawing from other guests from this panel. Wow, the connections here. Stephanie Boluk and Patrick LeMieux wrote a manifesto based on a book called Metagaming, which basically says that the biggest trick that the games industry ever pulled on us is to say that video games are games at all. Rather, games are a material for metagames, the opportunity for us to play. And we can play anything. It doesn't have to yet be a game, right? You can play, sure, on your phone, but I could equally play with my pot plant, or if I'm out in the stores and we just like playing with our words. There's so many different opportunities for that. Now, I'm very interested in creating opportunities for play that highlight particular experiences. And one of the things that I frequently find myself doing is like coming up with games that can be played in situations where there's a bit of downtime and you're with your friends, like you're waiting for a meal or something. And I always want to play something that's really social, but has a kind of focal point to it. So it's not just like the new games movement, which is very airy kind of games. Maybe they don't have win or lose conditions. I want a little bit more teeth, maybe something like Mafia, but like, oh, I don't carry cards around with me a lot of the time, and there's no time to pull out a huge board game. So I started, this is pre-pandemic, thinking about like, how do I create phone games that you could just play on your phone and pull them out anywhere. And I was inspired by games like Space Team, right? Where like everyone's on their phone and it's network multiplayer, but the actual game is happening here in the physical realm. It's between the players, it's in the air, it's in the voice. It's not actually in the code. The code is just a way to enable the shouting at your friends. And it's really interesting to think about the remediation that occurs when Space Team, which started out as an app, became a board game that also did really well. I play this with so many different types of people. I play this with my church. I play this with my wrestling crew. I play this with lots and lots, like little kids and older adults, and everyone just gets so exuberantly into it. Again, because regardless of the material, it's about the connection that you have with people. So when I started saying, okay, I want to make some of these games, I thought, okay, I'm going to have to code. Tricky thing is, not very good at code. In fact, I don't really care about code. Code is just another tool in our box of tools as designers, as people who can create and highlight experiences for players and for ourselves. So I didn't want to have to fuss around with networked multiplayer because I know that that's kind of difficult. And I'm just like not that interested in spending time in front of my computer doing this. I've made games that literally just use Keynote, right? So I decided I'm going to use just one important piece of code. It's seed random JavaScript library. Seed random is just a really cool little script that I don't even know how it works. It just magically makes your random number generator the same as everyone else's. So if you put in a single word, like the word Freeplay, and everyone put in that single word, suddenly all the random numbers that the JavaScript code would execute from that point on is actually the same. And with this magic kind of transformational line of code, you can do networked multiplayer experiences with no network multiplayer. For example, all I have to do in order to play, I don't know, like charade suddenly is pull out my phone, get you to pull out your phone. We all put in the seed word Freeplay, and suddenly we're all secretly looking at the same word. So everyone on the same team knows what word we're trying to get the other player or the other team to guess. And you can see the applications immediately, right? You can even do complex things like distribute cards to each player just by having a whole stack of cards in the system and telling the system how many players are there, what number position are you in this circle, so to speak, in terms of like I'm player A, you're player B, you're player C. The game just goes, okay, great. Well, I'm going to distribute internally all the cards, some to player A, some to player B, some to player C, and there's no network involved, and yet you can somehow magically make it feel as if there was a networked game. So I was really excited by this, and I was particularly excited by the idea that yes, you can play it anywhere by pulling out your phone and playing these games that had a tradition in board games because they're inherently social, but now we can start to use the medium of the random number generator and like what it means to create these these video games. And then COVID-19 hit. And my enthusiasm for this project was immediately transformed. It wasn't dampened at all. But what I realized was this was a huge opportunity to take what was something really fascinating about the game, to say that like these are actually theoretically playable over video chat, and lean into it even further. Now, there's a big problem. Games are about, in my mind, the board games, this kind of space of social experience play, they require a lot of the human contact about the pacing to get the attention correct, the focus. On Zoom, there's so much fatigue, so much energy being lost into the void of a screen with nothing back. Internet connection issues will make sure that everything will go wrong. There's just, if you've been teaching on Zoom like I have, you'll know that there's no way really to assess whether your students are getting any of the material or whether they're laughing at any of your jokes. I don't know if the Freeplay audience cares that I'm, talking at 100 miles per hour. Those things are really, really hard to decide. But what is crucial to me, the thing that I really wanted to design for, was the pure emotional effect of board games. When you're there with a bunch of people and you don't even know them necessarily, but you're just like staggered by the object of play, introducing or letting yourself be emotional in a new way. Maybe it's about being really competitive. Maybe it's about laughing at how ridiculous you've become. Games, and board games particularly, are a really great way to highlight and allow people to feel a little more expressive. So what did I want to do when I designed these games? Well, I wanted to think about that attention aspect. Zoom, I'm using Zoom as a metonym for the larger category of all video chat software. And there is an absolutely important discussion to be had about the appropriateness of Zoom and the political aspects of how Zoom as a platform is incredibly, literally technologically insecure, but by design. It is for particular stakeholders and a system of capitalism that makes money off its lack of privacy, and works hand in hand with different systems that historically oppress marginalized people. So it's really important to recognize all those things. It's also important to recognize that Zoom has basically magically taken over the world in this pandemic, and it is the platform that everyone is using. So it's kind of like, okay, if we're going to recognize that people are already on this platform and work with it, what are the affordances and limitations? Referencing more panelists again, Doug and Melissa in their earlier session created improv games, recognize these same limitations. So do check that panel out to have more in-depth discussion about things like playing with a frame, playing with breakout rooms and attention and all those kind of things. Whatever it was, I knew that I would have to get the pacing, the energy right, the stakes, I needed it to be high emotionally, even though it was being lost through a screen. So I started to think about the previous games that I had made. Here is a zine, Games for People, made by V. Buckingham and Patrick Ashe. They are the curators based in London, and they came up with, they reached out and came up with this zine full of folk games. And folk games are exceedingly good at the thing that I was talking about keep getting people in the playful mood. And I contributed to this. Here's one of my contributions. It's called Twofaced. So I said, it was actually a submission via tweet. Twofaced, players simultaneously say emotional states and then attempt to portray all the emotions on your face simultaneously. And this is a game that actually I made with my sister in a car many years ago. And so I designed this website, secretwebsite.link/Twofaced. And if you all go there, let's do that now, shall we? Secretwebsite.link/Twofaced. And I'm also going to do it on my phone. Don't click anything yet. We're going to play this game. And so you'll notice that there's a bunch of buttons. Sorry, there's one button, the star button. I would like you all to press that once. So now you will see, hopefully, astonished, amused, compassionate, panicked, frustrated, and powerless. And if you don't see that, then that's okay. You can just see this on the screen. But what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to I'm going to pick two of these and I'm going to portray them on my face. And then you at home are going to guess which two I'm portraying at the same time. Are you ready? Here we go. Which two emotions? All right, that was my face. If you guessed panicked and astonished, then you're correct. In the little group chat, Marie just like put her hands up. Yeah, and you can verify that if you're playing at home by pressing the start button, and you'll see that I was choosing panic and astonished. So again, we're all looking at the same words because of the seed random function, and we're able to give an answer and have this kind of moment of playful verification with each other. This works in a Zoom context because there is an audience aspect to it, an expressive performativity that comes from everyone watching one person alone. And then the kind of beautiful moment of revelation, having everyone go, yes, that was great, I was correct. You can do things like track score, like did you get 1 point because you got one adjective correct, or 2 points, and everyone can hold it up in front of the camera and track their points total. All of these interesting things about it. Anyway, I made a bunch of these games. I made a bunch of them, and then also reached out to a bunch of Italian designers who had reached out randomly for people to make like an app that was for people living in isolation and quarantine to play over videos, headed by Mattia Traverso. So it's really fascinating to see which games worked and which games didn't in the context. And actually, it ended up being really difficult to collaborate, particularly because everyone is just trying to survive in pandemic. So even under isolation, particularly in Italy, where they were isolated in Rome, we basically said, we don't have energy for this right now. But the process of collaborating over this and being able to come up with, I think we ended up with like 16 to 32 games that all worked on these same systems and tried to be as expressive and social as possible. So another example, like That's It, That's the Tweet was a game that got everyone to write tweets for each other. And, you know, each of the games tends to have some sort of either emotional stake or real world consequence to relate it to the larger context. I tweeted about it. I said, I've made 16 new games designed to be played over video chat. I'd love some help playtesting them over the next couple of days, and got a huge interest and response. People saying, yeah, you know what? I'm so tired and sick of playing Jackbox and all my, all the other games that kind of get old after a while. We want something new, we want something fresh. And so I came up with 3 sessions. If you're making sessions internationally, you got to think about time zones. Time zone math is the worst math. And we weren't designed to think in base 12 or 24. Nevertheless, very good to think about this kind of audience and cities of like who's coming, and maybe give suggestions of, oh, okay, well, like, you know, if you're in Europe, then this is going to be 12 noon, and just give an indication of that. It really helps people plan it out. And what actually happened? Well, we got 3 sessions full of amazing playtesters. In fact, in this little screenshot, I'm sure you can see Patrick and Stephanie, who are going to be talking a little later in this panel. And you'll see the chat is actually full of slashes. And the reason why the chat is full of slashes is because a cat walked over the keyboard at that point in time. We had a really fun time. You know, it was really exciting to see. Here's a warm-up exercise that we did where we tried to make a big face. I'm sure other people have tried to do this in Zoom. One thing I was really keen on recognizing is that there's such a loss of spatial sensibility when you're over Zoom. And so all the warm-ups had to do with playing with space to get in an attempt to try to get more of a physical connection. So can you get really close up to the camera? Can you get really, really far away? You know, I'm not going to do that. You know, and in doing so, maybe illuminate the space between us and create more of that physical connection as well. Here we have the results of the Twitter game that I mentioned very briefly, where people were writing tweets for each other based on an acronym. So one of my favorite submissions that came out of that, oh, what have I done? What have I done? I stopped sharing screen. That's okay. Was beautiful. I'll just read it out. It says, "Yes, Queen, I see only a half-ass. Good, sexy morning." And that was just like a beautiful kind of creation, collaborative creation that everyone contributed to, and then had a real world consequence in the form of a tweet. So what's the takeaway here? I'm still really excited about making games with this system, about thinking about random seeds and about how we play together and individually. And then I'm more interested, I guess, in how we can preserve the feeling of playing well together on online spaces. That notion of taking like in, you know, the photo that I took at Union Social, which took a bunch of random strangers to play board games. And the reason that works is because people trust that board games can create that space, that container for new friendships, for new modes of expression and play. I want the same thing to be happening over video chat, but in order to do that, we need to be really carefully curating and designing our experiences with intentional relations as the core, with the question of how do we connect with each other through this horrible hellscape of a software. Anyway, that's my talk. Thanks so much for tuning in. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Shang Woon. Yay! Virtual applause from kilometers away. We should be a little careful not to spend too much time, just so that we can get through the last 2 micro talks. But do we have one question for Shang Woon before we move on, from the chat or from any fellow panelists? Panelists, feel free to jump in, unmute yourself, and ask a question. I will if no one else has, but. Let me read a question from Patrick, hi Patrick, I'm going to talk in just a little bit. Question, what is the result of the playtests? Do you even think about it that way?
Yeah, so it's interesting because you frame it as a playtest, and as a game designer, you're implicitly saying you're playtesting it to create a polished experience that potentially has like a commercial or cultural output as a finished artifact. But the playtests, even though I framed it in that way, themselves were the outcome. Like it was really exciting to just be able to play these games with people. I am excited to eventually release these games more widely, and people are very welcome. Actually, while I'm speaking, if you want to play games with some of the tools that I've made, go check out secretwebsite.link/random. And it will just be a random word generator that I've put together for everyone. But it has the function of the seeding so that you can all look at the same random word. So there you go. There's a tool for everyone to go and make your own games with at home in the pandemic, as we're still isolating and staying at home where we can, wherever you are in the world. And so just thinking about yeah, rather than outcome of I'm going to release this commercially, it was more about, can we explore more intensely the actual effect of the games that I've designed on connectedness across people. The outcome was very positive. We created new friendships. There are people in the playtest made new relationships together, which I think is really beautiful. We came out beautiful friends, and we saved the world. We actually solved coronavirus, and it was eradicated because of us.
I'm going to sneak in one quick question. Cody Drew asks, what do you think is the most important thing regarding preserving the physical in the transfer to digital?
Okay, I won't think about the most important thing. I think like what are interesting things are questions of what affordances do to the aesthetic of play. So the example that I usually hark back to weirdly is Tetris. Like when Tetris came onto phones, one of the problems was that it was just like swipe left to move, swipe right to move, swipe down to do the block drop. And because of the way that our thumbs work, when you swipe down, it swipes down in an arc. I think Zach Gage talks about this in some talk, maybe talking about BitPilot. And that's really tricky, right? And so they came up with a new version of well, I turned my phone light on, Tetris, where instead of doing that, you just tapped on the screen where you want the Tetris to go. And it's a totally different mechanism. You no longer moved the pieces, and yet it managed to preserve the feeling of Tetris, that kind of same brain bendy aspects and the Tetris effect that, you know, you would think about pieces in your mind, although now they weren't falling, you're just thinking about where to place them. Much better than the finicky, like more like with greater fidelity left rightness of it. So I think the key thing is, and it's not the most important thing, but the key approach is forget about fidelity as a realistic mode of transfer. It's doesn't matter. There's not going to be a one-to-oneness. And I think the more that you really interrogate the relationship and break the one-to-oneness, the better result you're going to get, because you'll be able to lean in to the affordances of the new medium. So similarly, when I create new games for the phone, I'm not actually interested in transferring full stop. I'm actually creating new things that are only possible with the phone. Like, what about games that start to use random chance in new ways? Or like games where you have a deck of cards that changes every single time, because that's something that digital can only do.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's keep moving. We got 2 more micro talks. Thank you, Shang Woon. Next up, and feel free to unmute yourself, Melissa. Hi, Melissa.
Hey.
Hello. Great. We can hear you clearly. So, and Melissa, try sharing your slides while I introduce you. And if you run into any issues, we can come solve them. But Melissa McGlensey, hello, is a Melbourne-based comedian and writer. In addition to being a regular contributor to the Batuta Advocate and Reductress, Melissa is also a company member of Sooth Players, Completely Improvised Shakespeare, and she is the director of Melbourne's Completely Improvised Potter. Great, we can see your slides, Melissa. I will mute myself. Please take it away.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. Apologies, because of technical difficulties, I'm going to be facing this way, but I am speaking directly to you in my heart. Great. So, as Doug said, my name is Melissa, and today I want to talk to you about improv comedy and the playful ways in which performance groups like mine have been using games to adapt to lockdown conditions. For context, I just want to quickly explain what improv comedy is. So improv comedy is an art form wherein performers invent comedic scenes, scenarios, and situations right before your very eyes. It's one of the few art forms where the creation of it and the performance of it happen at exactly the same time. And it is usually done in teams of people somewhere between 2 to 10. It requires a live audience, and it typically does not translate well to film. This is an important point that I will come back to in just a moment. Sorry, I realize those aren't coming up. There we go. One of the groups I'm involved with here in Melbourne is Completely Improvised Potter. I'm the director of this group. And as we do a 1-hour live show set in the universe of the Harry Potter books, which, as we all know, were famously written by Daniel Radcliffe. As I was saying, Completely Improvised Potter is a narrative improv show where we perform an entire year at Hogwarts based on an audience suggestion. It is part of a larger tradition of genre prov, which is a word that I made up and I'm going to be using a lot today. But it is where you apply the creative constraints of a time period, genre, or fictional world to long-form improv. This is a disputed point within the community, but I personally, sorry, I'm having a little bit of technical, there we go. But I personally believe that genre prov is more satisfying than regular improv because of the additions of these constraints. It adds structure to our show, it grounds us in a specific place and time, and it gives the audience a pop culture reference point to hold on to. In essence, the genre constraint keeps us from flying off into total absurdity, which is something I'm well aware that improv has a bad reputation for doing. One important observation about improv comedy is that it's inherently ephemeral and fleeting. Improv thrives on a live audience. Doing it requires being completely present in the moment, as does watching it. It's often really funny live in a way that would seem flat or even confusing when it's rewatched later. Now, to be clear, I love this quality of improv. It is one of my favorite things about improv, but it also, unfortunately, means that it is not ideal during a pandemic. Basically, the large number of people required to be on stage and in the audience means that COVID-19 has effectively put improv on hold for the time being. Now, to be clear, oh, sorry. Oh, I have lost myself. Great, I found it. That means that thanks to the pandemic, not only were shows canceled, but our rehearsals were canceled as well. And this is a huge bummer because for us, rehearsal is very fun. It is not just a skills practice and a social interaction, it is also a chance to spend a few hours in our favorite fictional universe. In a typical rehearsal, we would practice the different character physicalities, accents, and mannerisms. We would also do work on group coordination, spontaneity, and brush up on our Potter knowledge and trivia. With in-person gatherings of this size disallowed, where did this leave us? We can't rehearse, we can't perform, we can't, quote, go to Hogwarts, as we like to call it. We aren't left with many options. Are we supposed to just let these skills atrophy, not connect with our teammates, not spend any time in the Potterverse? The answer, curiously, is not to just reproduce our rehearsals online. This harkens back to what Harry was just speaking of about fidelity, but I've taught a few online classes, and frankly, it just doesn't compare. Again, we're back to this concept that improv has an ephemeral quality. There's something about it in person that makes it really sing, and without body language, eye contact, and physical presence, it just feels stilted and unnatural. So while we were still reeling from the loss of our rehearsals and shows, other comedians were working out new ways of connecting performers together. My good friend Christina Spizica at the Improv Conspiracy, which is one of the main theaters here in Melbourne, started up a weekly game night for the 100-person pool of house team performers. On Thursday nights, which is the night we would normally be cramming into the theater in the Melbourne CBD to perform, we instead started gathering online to play Jackbox Party Pack. Now, for some context, Jackbox Party Pack is a popular collection of simple social games played on your phone, either in the same room or over the internet. So this weekly night turned out to be very fun. As you can imagine, playing these kinds of party games where the whole goal is to make each other laugh is next level fun when it is done with improvisers and comedians. As we played, I started to realize that though these games aren't exactly improv, they do start to echo some of the things that happen when we improvise. The jokes we'd tell through these games had the same sort of irreverent quality as a lot of the improv we did together on stage. We also engaged in the same sort of self-referential in-joking that is a hallmark of the form. It occurred to me that this kind of gameplay can scratch some of the proverbial improv itch. It's doing a similar thing both structurally and socially. So inspired by this weekly game site, my improvised Potter ensemble also doubled down on Jackbox games. First and foremost, we decided to modify the games by setting them all in the Potterverse. This genreification was a really natural fit for Quiplash, one of the Jackbox games where you try to come up with funny answers to simple prompts, Mad Lib style. And what we did was impose the house rule that all answers had to be Potter related. Here's another Jackbox game called TKO, where players draw pictures and submit captions for teammates to assemble into funny t-shirts. This game was also really easily repurposed. We decided that both the drawings and the catchphrases all had to be Potter themed. The Jackbox game, Patently Stupid, was one of the most useful to adapt for our purposes. For those who aren't familiar with the game, it asks you to pitch product ideas infomercial style. It's practically already an improv game in that it asks you to monologue on the spot, which is something I frequently ask my performers to do in rehearsal. Our house rules dictated that these infomercial style presentations had to be done in character. You can see here one that was done in character as Voldemort. Now, after playing a few sessions with the cast, I realized that two things were happening simultaneously here. The first was that house ruling or genrefying these games may not have been a perfect replacement for improv shows or rehearsals, but it allowed us to access some of that same fun. Somehow, it did this even better than just moving the same old rehearsals online. The genreification also worked in the other direction. Adding creative limitations made our Jackbox play much more fun. Playing this way helps my cast sharpen their improv by practicing accents, character points of view, the specifics of the world, as well as improv skills like callbacks, heightening, and support. And playing this much more specific version of Jackbox made it so much more interesting and rewarding for us. By the way, quick shout out to my castmate Pedro, who you can see here, purchased one of the shirts from our game and is modeling it. The experiment proved to be repeatable. I know this because I'm also a cast member in two other genre ensembles, and we tried it with them as well. Members of the cast of Soothplayers Completely Improvised Shakespeare played Jackbox using Elizabethan language and themes, as well as including time period specifics. And my improvised Jane Austen troupe did much the same. We played using language and tropes relating to the landed gentry of Regency-era England, with, of course, a bit of creative license for delightful anachronism. We can also think beyond just the Jackbox games and experiment with other games and platforms. One of the producers of Soothplayers, Adam Hembry, started a Shakespeare-themed Dungeons and Dragons campaign for us. All of the characters speak in Elizabethan language, complete with occasional songs and soliloquies. We meet once a week over video chat, which has been a delightful way to dust off our language skills, scratch that improv itch, and keep our close cast bond intact. Also, just as a side note, Adam, our amazing DM, even does our end of session recaps in a sonnet. It is both true that D&D gave us a way to do genre prov, and that adding the extra difficulty of Shakespeareifying D&D has made the game more interesting to us. It's not actually that surprising that this Shakespeareification makes D&D more rewarding for me. In fact, that tracks perfectly with something I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Heightening the experience of gameplay through constraint mirrors what we've been doing all along to improv itself by adding genre on top of it. The same can be said for Jackbox or D&D, and I'm sure for many other different forms of gameplay. In fact, there is so much that improv and gameplay have in common. In a sense, improv is basically just a game we're playing on stage for your spectating enjoyment. Genre prov, whether on stage or imposed upon a social video game, helps us bring our own energy, house rules, and creative constraints to the table. That's it for my talk. Thank you guys so much for having me, and thanks to Freeplay.
Yay, thanks, Melissa.
Yeah.
If you can, stop sharing your screen. We'll go back to gallery view. And do we have any questions from the YouTube chat or from our fellow panelists for Melissa? Before we move on, we have one more final micro talk after this.
I'm trying to stop the share.
No worries.
There you go.
Melissa, one question to start with from Marie, actually. Is there anything you would bring from improv online into your work in person in the future? So going back that opposite direction.
That's really interesting. Doug and I taught a workshop this morning on some improv games we've adapted to video chat. And I was thinking about that while we were doing it. And one of the features I really love from playing games online is this ability to meta commentate or chat while it's happening, which we just can't do in improv out of politeness, right? If someone is on stage performing, it's really hard to be talking to each other about how much you're enjoying this or that you stand this or that or whatever. And I wish there was a way to bring that into the room. We do it afterwards a lot, especially in Improvised Potter. We'll have a rehearsal where we do a scene and it's really fun and joyful, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. But yeah, I'd like to look into ways to like allowing for that engagement from the sidelines more.
Great. By the way, we might run, I've been given latitude by Freeplay just to run a couple minutes late if we need. So there'll also be a chance for a couple of final questions at the very end. But we have one more micro talk. Last chance for any questions for Melissa. I know there's a delay between when I talk and when the chat actually receives the audio. We'll give a few minutes for all the panelists to chime in at any final questions after the final micro talk as well. So why don't we move on to the final micro talk. And as they share the screen, I am going to introduce, hello, Patrick and Stephanie.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Can you hear us?
Yes, we can. Patrick LeMieux and Stephanie Boluk play, make, and write about games at the University of California, Davis. They are co-authors of Metagaming, co-creators of metagames like Triforce, The Topologies of Zelda, and cast members on the Every Game in the City podcast. I know it is late where they are, so we are very thankful. Hello, Patrick and Stephanie, tuning in all the way from California. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks very much. So I'm Patrick LeMieux. I almost said I'm Stephanie Boluk.
And I'm Stephanie Boluk.
Can you tell it's a little late for us? So we're professors at the University of California, Davis, although we're currently living and working in a street-level storefront in downtown Oakland. And after 3 months of self-isolation, the city has rapidly moved from social distancing to social justice. People have put on masks to take to the streets. Oh yeah, are we getting our PowerPoint? So here's Davis. Here's Oakland. People have put on masks and taken to the streets to protest the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and Sean Monterosa, along with many, many other victims of extrajudicial police violence. And the OPD have not responded well. Slow, then sudden, bored, then scared, playing Sudoku, then protesting, the emotional and cognitive whiplash of this particular moment is but one symptom of the precarity of life in the new millennium.
And that's why we actually wanted to start with Susan Sontag's 1964 essay, The Imagination of the Disaster. In it, she characterizes the Cold War as the, quote, continual threat of two equally fearful but seemingly opposed destinies, unremitting banality and inconceivable terror. More recently on Twitter, Asma Nizami actually makes a similar point, saying, I personally think it's really cool how we all went from learning how to bake banana bread to learning how to abolish the police in a matter of weeks. So on one side of the coin, there's the terror of the coronavirus death toll, the exploitation of essential workers, inordinately people of color, the omnipresence of police brutality, the decoupling of financial markets from labor markets, and the rise of global fascism. On the other side, there's the banality of making a sourdough starter, playing Animal Crossing, doing yoga with Adrian, and what we'll be talking about today, Sudoku. So it may seem impossible to hold the two sides of this coin together, but our rituals of play negotiate these seemingly opposed destinies. In 2020, completing a daily Sudoku and getting tear gassed are not as far apart as we'd think.
And as you all probably know, Sudoku is the numerical logic puzzle, usually structured by a 9x9 grid, bifurcated further into 9 3x3 subgrids. And to complete the puzzle, each row and column must contain the numbers 1 through 9. Each subgrid must also contain the numbers 1 through 9. And no digit can be repeated in the same row, column, or subgrid. So Sudoku doesn't have a particularly long history. It resembles ancient mathematical curiosities like the magic squares and 19th century arithmetic puzzles that circulated in French newspapers pre-war, but Sudoku is primarily a 21st century phenomenon. Originally given the blunt yet descriptive name number place, these types of logic puzzles were first codified by an Indianapolis architect, Howard Garnes, in the late 70s. Then they gained regional popularity in Japan via the monthly Nicolist in the mid-80s, where they were renamed to an equally straightforward title, Single Digit, which got shortened to Sudoku. Finally, Sudoku was industrialized and published globally in the 90s after the development of Wayne Gould's Papacom computer software for generating puzzles. And we actually downloaded Papacom while we were trying it out. And while we were trying out some of its randomly generated puzzles on our roof, 2 police helicopters started circling our building, broadcasting through a megaphone, this is the OPD, get off the rooftops, go inside. So curfew pierces into private homes, and it's now against the rules to solve Sudoku on your own roof.
In the 2000s, Sudoku was quickly co-opted as edutainment, brain training, cognitive neuroscience, and anxiety management. Pop psychologist and author of Total Brain Workout, Marcel Dinesi writes, quote, the satisfaction that comes from solving a puzzle seems to provide relief from the large-scale puzzles inherent in everyday life. They are a powerful form of escapism. To paraphrase a well-known and very sage saying, an hour of crosswords or Sudoku a day keeps the doctor, and everyone else for that matter, away. So prior to the pandemic, Sudoku was already being imagined as a kind of quarantine media, a way to self-isolate through a single-player puzzle. And since Oakland implemented a curfew, we now turn the lights off at dusk and we sit in the dark listening to the police as they roam outside our door. I worry about my neighbors. Will a Sudoku a day keep the cops away?
Dinesi's rhetoric of Sudoku as therapy is leveraged explicitly in the popular Cracking the Cryptic channel on YouTube. You might recognize that name from when their Miracle Sudoku video went viral last month. The channel is run by Simon Anthony and Mark Goodliff, 2 UK puzzlers who regularly compete at the World Sudoku Championships. And although they've been quietly operating since 2017, their channel went viral during the pandemic, jumping from 5,000 subscribers to 90,000. Tagged self-isolation, quarantine, antidote, cure, boredom, coronavirus vaccine, and featuring titles like The Puzzling Side Effects of COVID-19 and The Puzzling Antidote to Self-Isolation, these videos often start with a short disclaimer. The world is changing at the moment. Over the last 2 years, we've had probably 10 emails from people who suffer from various forms of poor mental health, and they've really found this channel to help them because it occupies their minds and gets their brain involved. At times when we're all feeling a bit lonely, I think this channel could be useful to many of us. And it has been pretty useful. Cracking the Cryptic combines one form of isolation media, the Sudoku, with another, the Let's Play, in order to produce a show that sits somewhere between cooking videos and speedruns. While streaming Cracking the Cryptic videos, sometimes the local news gets automatically queued, and we find ourselves watching Mayor Libby Schaaf and Chief Susan Mannheimer lie to us. We hear them defend Oakland PD's unprompted use of tear gas, flashbangs, and sting balls. full 20 minutes before curfew. But we were there in the crowd with the Oakland Tech high school students, and we saw what happened. Instead of being gaslit over tear gas, we returned to Sudoku. It's harder to lie in Sudoku.
In Sudoku, there's only ever one answer. And unlike the computer-generated grids in the New York Times or most printed puzzle books, following the puzzle designer's logic in a handmade Sudoku is a two-player game. So we started playing along with the Cracking the Cryptic videos. The first thing we adopted was their use of the Snyder notation. This is a method where pencil marks are used only whenever a given number is limited to 2 places in a subgrid. And the skeuomorphic notation helps to not only remember where numbers can go, but it actively produces logical relationships between the numbers. So for example, when 2 matching sets of pencil marks align either horizontally or vertically, they suddenly have consequences in a third block. This is called an X-wing. And there's also Y-wings and XYZ wings, which can cycle, chain, and loop. There are swordfish and jellyfish with and without fins. There's 3D medusas, death blossoms, and by-value universal graves. And I don't know why the names of Sudoku strategies are so metal. As we learn them, we also start to see the strategies at protests. We can see the police setting up their lines. They're looking up and down the rows and columns of Oakland's streets. They're making subgrids. As we plan our lines of flight, we see their flanking positions in the X-wing shape. Based on what corner we move, they can tighten up their ranks and kettle us at any time. And every day, they're changing the rules. They're making variations. They're placing new constraints on how to exercise the First Amendment.
So it may not be a surprise to you that there are many adaptations, variations, and mods of Sudoku, which add unique constraints beyond the original 1 through 9 in each row, column, and subgrid. For example, in chess Sudoku, a number cannot be repeated within a given chess move from itself, limiting numeric repetitions inside the movements of knights, kings, queens, anti-knights, anti-queens, anti-kings, and more. Sandwich Sudoku adds numbers to the perimeter of a grid, signifying the sum of the digits sandwiched between 1 and 9 in each column. And something like Thermo Sudoku adds thermometers, arbitrary lines, each terminating with a circular bulb, along the length of which numbers must only increase. The Cracking the Cryptic team has capitalized on these mods, quickly iterating on collections of handcrafted Sudoku puzzles and releasing them in lightweight Unity apps over the last month. Whether it's Killer Sudoku or Skyscraper Sudoku or Jigsaw Sudoku or even the elaborate Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time themed Sudoku puzzle hunt designed by ex-speedrunner Anis, there's been a rapid expansion of Sudoku mods as a result of the adoption of efficient solving algorithms like the Snyder notation and X-wing that we mentioned earlier. So the metagame is evolving and adapting, and the player and puzzle makers are also changing. So we've been trying to adapt as well. We wrote this talk with cop cars lined up outside our house. They use our street as a staging area for dozens of SUVs with lights strobing, occasionally with the sirens on. And they're making a Sudoku town to be organized, controlled, and quarantined, each body isolated to a single cell. Our particular cell happens to be a block away from their HQ.
Anat Singh's Mushroom at the End of the World is a 300-page tome masquerading as a book about mushrooms that's really about feminist materialist philosophy on how to live and die in the Anthropocene. And she writes, "What do you do when your world starts to fall apart? I go for a walk, and if I'm lucky, I find mushrooms. Mushrooms pull me back into my senses because they pop up unexpectedly, reminding me of the good fortune of just happening to be there. Then I know that there are still pleasures amidst the terrors of indeterminacy." So it could be mushrooms, or it could be Animal Crossing, or Google Spreadsheets, or Zoom, or Sudoku. Rituals of play are not the means to escape and find joy elsewhere, but it's a way to recognize when we can still find these moments of calm, control, and concentration here, right now, before stepping outside into air that, at least in our case, is filled with tear gas one day and wildfire smoke the next. We build survival strategies for living in an era of emotional and cognitive whiplash, where, as Susan Sontag said, unremitting banality and inconceivable terror are inescapably bound to one another. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, big round of applause for Patrick and Stephanie. Thanks, that was terrific. Let's open up for questions from the chat or from fellow panelists, and then we might cap it off with just a couple of general questions. I know there were some leftover questions for Melissa, and then maybe any synthesis cross presenter questions. Any immediate questions? So let me start this off by saying, as we wait for any possible questions, Patrick and Stephanie, part of what I like some of the contrast is in the earlier talks, we heard about a number of games of thinking about networked play, right? People playing over a network, playing Animal Crossing or Jackbox. Whereas this like Sudoku together is like the other side of lockdown, like being intimately trapped with a partner. And so trying to find new rituals together in your like co-located space, like almost the opposite of networked play. Were there other, did you feel that in terms of needing new intimate rituals between the two of you being trapped together? Were there other kind of like non-network games like that had filled that same kind of banality, so to speak, that you were talking about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one thing we didn't really talk about in the talk itself is that like we like to collaborate on the Sudoku, so like have one screen and do it together with the added rule that you must explain any number placement that you want to do. But I think one thing that ties Sudoku into the rest of the talks is that I think it is like a very networked phenomenon right now. Like, I know that stuff like Cracking the Cryptic has existed for many years. There have been like groups of people doing Sudoku tutorials or Sudoku puzzles online, but to make it a kind of spectator-friendly experience and to make it into this kind of genre of bingeable YouTube video is pretty new. And the folks kind of playing along have formed a community together. So that I think is really interesting in relation to this like long form digital game. Sudoku, I think, has almost for its entire lifetime, as we all know it, been like a product of computation. But to see it networked is super interesting right now.
Yeah, I think I think when you talk to a lot of people, they'll say, "Oh, my dad plays Sudoku," or it's like if you're on an airplane, if we'll ever take airplanes ever again, like maybe you've seen it in the back of an airplane magazine or played it or tried it out in a waiting room if it's not like a game that you've played regularly. And I think what was interesting about this moment, and this goes back to I think some of the things that Rami was saying, talking about how the release of Animal Crossing at this particular moment in time, it did a specific kind of work because of the fact that it coincided with the kind of start of the pandemic and the start of when people were going into quarantine. I think that with this YouTube channel, like Sudoku's been around for a while, but all of a sudden it was a means through which, people had perhaps they were in the space, right, where they were isolated at home. And so this was like a good opportunity to do a game that you can play by yourself that takes about 30 minutes, that isn't too sort of politically or culturally taxing. And in this moment of the pandemic, I think that obviously clearly by the way that like the Miracle Sudoku went viral spoke to a lot of people. And I think we were really interested in sort of following that and thinking about that in terms of the longer history of Sudoku. But then at the same time, like for us, lockdown was I think 33 days ago. 93 days. Sorry, 93. It's late here. It was 93 days ago, and it was actually the same day that Breonna Taylor was murdered, and so it's been holding these like two separate but yet somehow entwined issues. And over the past week, I think the world kind of collectively decided that we were no longer social distancing, but we were going to fight so we were going to fight for social justice now, the pandemic of racism. And the way in which suddenly, at least for us, I think like the mechanics of Sudoku, the formal logic of Sudoku, right? Like the world is messy, and this is a very, Sudoku is a problem that can be solved.
Mhm.
There's only one answer. There can only ever even be one answer by definition. And it was things like that, where those sort of contradictions and tensions and moving between all of our different sort of responsibilities in this town, it it all sort of came to a head.
Yeah, thanks. I have one more question for Patrick and Stephanie from the Zone, and then we have a leftover question or two for Melissa. This is your final chance, as we answer these questions, to ask any questions for either a particular panelist or all of the panelists, because we're going to wrap this up after like 2 or 3 more questions. But first, Stephanie and Patrick from the Zone. A little paraphrased, are any of the Sudoku mods from the community that you've been following, are any of those mods about venting and expressing personal emotions?
Yes. So I would say a lot of the formats, like the conventions, are not necessarily about personal emotions, but one thing that's super interesting about this particular moment of Sudoku is, like, if you've ever played a New York Times Sudoku or Sudoku in the back of a airline magazine, or the Sudokus even publish books of Sudoku puzzles, those are computer generated Sudokus. And once you have people handcrafting Sudoku puzzles, all kinds of interesting things start to happen. So it's very easy to tell specific designers, for example, like, oh, this is another puzzle by such and such for sure. So you start to get a little bit of a 2-player thing going on with whoever the puzzle designer is, and they can make kind of runs of puzzles. So it's pretty typical to see a Sudoku hunt or a run of puzzles by the same designer. The other thing you'll see is with some of the thermometers, you can use those to draw a smiley face or draw the initials of somebody. And so you see birthday Sudokus with like the initials of somebody in them, or other ways to kind of represent symbols or to use secret messages in them, which is very, very interesting.
It's a constrained artistic palette, but I guess a palette nonetheless. What I find interesting is when you can actually see when a designer has a specific strategy that they want you to use, and they want you to use it again and again and again. So it's sort of like, I don't know, it's like the chorus of a song or something, where you have to keep coming back to it. And that moment of realization, when you realize that the sort of placement and problem solving isn't arbitrary, but it's been following the designer's path, is kind of a very exhilarating thing. That's only, I think it's exclusively a product of the handcrafted form of puzzle. And that type of puzzle, you're starting to see that a lot more because of the fact that there's a growing audience for it.
And some, not to dwell too long, but something like that Zelda puzzle hunt, which I 100% recommend to everybody in the chat, just like Google Zelda Sudoku puzzle hunt, is awesome because it actually comes out of the speedrunning bingo scene. So we don't have to get all the way into it, but like Ocarina of Time bingo is a bingo card that is randomly generated with weighted values for specific goals within the game that speedrunners then race to try and see if they can complete the bingo card. And this is like a classic speedrunning metagame. And so out of that bingo scene comes this weird Sudoku puzzle hunt in which you still have to collect like bombs in order to do such and such, or I need these types of boots before I go to that temple. So there is a little bit of funny kind of Zelda trivia in it, which seems very personal, or at least niche to that community.
Great. I think we'll wrap up just a couple more leftover questions for Melissa, her talk on Jackbox and improv. Melissa, Nick Chin asks, have online role-playing forums or role-playing had any influence on genre prov, as far as you know, or the work that you specifically do?
I can't speak to what influence there is on that community. Strictly speaking, I'm very new to role player games. Right. About a year ago was the first time I ever did any, and those were just a few one-offs. So I can't speak with authority on how it has influenced that community, but I think it's definitely influenced the way I play, or the way I will play once we're allowed to play again. Specifically with Sooth Players, the improvised Shakespeare group, it is like the D&D we're playing is so character-based, And the work we do on stage is character-based, but it's also more like story-driven than character, I would say. So I think as a result of the entire cast playing this way, we will see a more character-driven bent in our improv. Also, just very funny to me is that, at least in my campaign, because there are 2 campaigns, everyone is playing a D&D character that is just a heightened version of themselves, which is probably common. I'm not sure, it's my first time doing it, but it's very interesting to see like our bad improv habits or our bad on-stage tics amplified in this way in D&D. And I wonder if it is working for us or against us. Because in some ways it might be a safe space for us to like work on those bad habits we don't want to bring to the stage. But in other ways, are we getting complacent and used to bringing those with us onto the stage as well?
Final question. We'll end with one kind of we've had a couple people leave early because we're a little over time, but final question for our remaining panelists from Daniel Green. Noting in a comment, I've thought about how luxurious or even privileged playing games can be as escapism. For the whole panel to consider, is there latitude at this time to games as a platform for organizing for social change? Feel free to unmute. If you don't have any thoughts, that's okay as well. It's a big question for sure. Is there latitude at this time for games as a platform for organizing for social change?
Thank you for the question. It's an interesting one. I think it could go in a couple different ways. So I think that you could think of these kinds of quiet respites that maybe games allow as something needed either physically or mentally to prepare for activity, right? To prepare for something else. So you can instrumentalize them in that way. I think the ways that games represent stories or tell narratives about our current time is another way. But also I think like the way that game makers are leveraging kind of their institutions they're involved with, whether that's unions, or I'm thinking specifically maybe of the Itch.io bundle for racial equity and justice, which I think raised $5 million, and it's definitely worth grabbing. I think it's still online for maybe a day or two more. It's something really interesting because it's a way to think about kind of channeling the resources of an institution, in this case a storefront, into other institutions that might be able to make a difference.
Yes, thank you. Any final thoughts? Totally not required, but any from the other panelists? No? Okay, it was I think a good note to end on though. Thank you for the answer. Thank you for the question. Thanks to everyone out in the YouTube live chat for tuning in and asking questions. Huge thanks to all our 6 panelists from different time zones, early, late, here in Melbourne, for putting in all this prep time, talking to all of us. I've super enjoyed it. So maybe virtual applause in the chats for all our speakers. And I know I said this at the beginning, but huge thank you to Freeplay and Melbourne Knowledge Week for organizing this. I know, right, like Freeplay is usually in person, and I know Chad and the whole team had to scramble to put this online, which was a lot of work. So please, everyone, also a big round of applause for the whole Freeplay team putting in all this work to bring this to all of us. So I really appreciate being a part of this. So yeah, brilliant. Well, I don't know if the Freeplay folks are still here. We're gonna go offline, but thank you. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And I think the Freeplay organizers will tell us when the call is fully offline.